乘客您好，中研美容医院提醒您，自由大陆到了，有去往自由大陆方向的乘客，请带好随身物品，准备下车。You are arriving at 自由大陆. Please be ready for getting off.
When I first walked the stretch of road which visitors coming from the light railway station must traverse in order to reach the large iron gates of the so-called Manchurian puppet palace of Puyi, I was struck by the sheer amount of hubbub and general commotion, which in this now impoverished area of town is taken as course in order to pay reparations to modern society. It was not one single factor or observation that I did during this walk that, some years later, led me to return with a video camera in order to document the scene, but rather the general state of decay and disrepair, the ambivalent backwardness and timeless quality of the sun settling upon the common people within the imperial landscape, all of which, incidentally, added greatly to the location's historical significance and elemental atmosphere. In China, the placating of the elements has always been intimately connected with the ceremonial rites which surrounded the ruler on the dragon throne and which governed everything from affairs of state down to daily ablutions, rituals that also served to legitimize and immortalize the immense profane power that was focused in the person of the emperor. At any moment of the day or night, the members of the imperial household, which numbered more than 6,000 and consisted exclusively of eunuchs and women, would be circling, on precisely defined orbits, the sole male inhabitant of the forbidden city that lay concealed behind purple-colored walls. In the latter half of the 19th century, the ritualization of imperial power was at its most elaborate, at the same time that power itself was by now almost completely hollowed out, while all court appointments, rigidly controlled as they were by an immutable hierarchy, continued to be made according to rules that had been perfected down to the last detail. The empire in its entirety was on the brink of collapse, owing to mounting pressure from enemies both within and without. In the 1850s and 1860s, the Taiping Rebellion, launched by a messianic Christian Confucian movement, spread like wildfire across all of southern China. Reeling with privation and poverty, the people, from starving peasants and soldiers at large after the Opium War to coolies, sailors, actors and prostitutes, flocked in undreamt of numbers to the self-appointed celestial king, Hung Chia-Chuan, who in a feverish delirium had beheld a glorious future in which justice prevailed. Soon a steadily growing army of holy warriors was making its way northwards from Guangxi. It overran the provinces of Hunan, Hebei and Anhui, and in early 1853 was at the gates of the mighty city of Nanking, which was overwhelmed after a two-day siege and was declared the celestial capital of the movement. Fired by the prospect of a golden age, the rebellion now flooded wave upon wave across the whole vast country. More than 6,000 citadels were taken by the rebels and occupied for a while. 5 provinces were razed to the ground in battle after battle, and more than 20 million died in just 15 years. The bloody horror in China at that time went beyond all imagining. In the summer of 1864, after a 7-year siege by imperial forces, Nanking fell. The defenders had long since exhausted their supplies, and had abandoned all hope of attaining in this life the paradise which had seemed within reach when the movement began. Broken by hunger and drugs, they were on their last legs. On the 30th of June the celestial king took his own life. Hundreds of thousands followed his example, either out of loyalty or for fear of the conqueror's revenge. They committed self-slaughter in every conceivable way, with swords and with knives. by fire, by hanging, or by leaping from the rooftops and towers. Many are even said to have buried themselves alive. The mass suicide of the Tupinguis is without historical parallel. When their enemies broke through the gates on the morning of the 19th of July, they found not a soul alive, but the city was filled with the humming of flies. The king of the celestial realm of eternal peace, according to a dispatch sent to Peking, lay face down in a gutter, his bloated body held together only by the silken robes of imperial yellow, adorned with the image of the dragon, which, with blasphemous presumption, he had always worn. Suppressing the Taiping Rebellion would almost certainly have proved impossible had not the British Army contingents in China taken the imperial side after the resolution of their own conflict with the Emperor. The armed presence of the British dated back to 1840, to the beginning of the so-called Opium War. In 1837 the Chinese government had taken measures to prevent opium trading, whereupon the East India Company, which grew opium poppies in the fields of Bengal and shipped the drug mainly to Canton, Amoy and Shanghai, felt that one of its most lucrative ventures was in jeopardy. The subsequent declaration of war began the opening up, by force of arms, of the Chinese Empire, which for 200 years had remained closed to foreign barbarians. In the name of Christian evangelism and free trade, which was held to be the precondition of all civilized progress, the superiority of Western artillery was demonstrated, a number of cities were stormed, and a peace was extorted, the conditions of which included guarantees for British trading posts on the coast, the cession of Hong Kong, and, not least, reparation payments of truly astronomical proportions. Insofar as this arrangement, which from the outset the British regarded as purely interim, made no provision for access to trading centres within China itself, the need for further military campaigns could not be ruled out in the longer term, especially in view of the existence of 400 million Chinese to whom the cotton fabrics produced in the Lancashire mills might have been sold. It was not, however, until 1856 that an adequate pretext for a new punitive expedition presented itself, when Chinese officials in the port of Canton boarded a freighter to arrest some members of the old Chinese crew who were suspected of piracy. But since the boarded ship was registered in Hong Kong and was flying the Union Jack rightfully, the incident, laughable in itself, provided the representatives of British interests in Canton with the occasion for a confrontation with the Chinese authorities, which was presently and deliberately pushed so far that there was felt to be no alternative but to occupy the port and bombard the official residence of the prefect. At very nearly the same time, as luck would have it, the French press was running reports of the execution, on the orders of officials in Guangxi province, of a missionary named Chap Delane. The description of this painful procedure culminated in the claim that the executioner had cut the heart from the breast of the dead abbé, and cooked and eaten it. The cries for retaliation and punishment, which promptly filled France, chimed perfectly with the endeavours of the warmongers in Westminster, so that, once the necessary preparations had been made, there was witnessed the spectacle of a joint Anglo-French campaign, a rare phenomenon in the age of imperial rivalry. This enterprise, which was dogged by the greatest of logistical difficulties, entered its crucial phase in August 1860 with the landing of 18,000 British and French troops in the Bay of Chile, barely 150 miles from Peking. supported by a Chinese auxiliary force recruited in Canton, they captured the forest of Taku that stood surrounded by deep ditches, immense earthworks and bamboo palisades amidst saltwater marshes at the mouth of the Peiho River. After the fortress garrison had unconditionally surrendered and attempts were being made to put an orderly end, by negotiation, to a campaign that had already been concluded from a military point of view, the Allied delegates, despite the fact that they had the upper hand, became ever more lost in a nightmarish maze of diplomatic prevarication dictated partly by the complex requirements of protocol in the Dragon Empire and partly by the fear and bewilderment of the Emperor. In the end, the negotiations founded on the mutual incomprehension of emissaries from two fundamentally different worlds, a gap which no interpreter could bridge. While the British and French side viewed the peace they would impose as the first stage in the colonization of a moribund realm untouched by the intellectual and material achievements of civilization, the Emperor's delegates, for their part, endeavored to make clear to these strangers, who appeared to be unfamiliar with Chinese ways, the immemorial obligations toward the Son of Heaven of envoys from satellite powers bound to pay homage and tribute. In the end, there was nothing for it but to sail up the Peiho in gunboats and advance on Peking overland. Emperor Xianfeng, who was debilitated despite his youthful years and suffered from dropsy, shirked the impending confrontation, departing on the 22nd of September for his retreat at Zhou beyond the Great Wall amidst a disorderly array of court eunuchs, mules, baggage carts, litters and palanquins. Word was conveyed to the commanders of the enemy forces that His Majesty the Emperor was obliged by law to go hunting in autumn. In early October the Allied troops, themselves now uncertain how to proceed, happened apparently by chance on the magic garden of Juan near Peking. With its countless palaces, pavilions, covered walks, fantastic arbors, temples and towers. On the slopes of man-made mountains, between banks and spinneys, deer with fabulous antlers grazed, and the whole incomprehensible glory of nature and of the wonders placed it in by the hand of man was reflected in dark, unruffled waters. The destruction that was wrought in these legendary landscaped gardens over the next few days, which made a mockery of military discipline, or indeed of all reason, can only be understood as resulting from anger at the continued delay in achieving a resolution. Yet the true reason why Juan was laid waste may well have been that this earthly paradise, which immediately annihilated any notion of the Chinese as an inferior and uncivilized race, was an irresistible provocation in the eyes of soldiers who, a world away from their homeland, knew nothing about the rule of force, privation, and the abnegation of their own desires. Although the accounts of what happened in those October days are not very reliable, the sheer fact that booty was later auctioned off in the British camp suggests that much of the removable ornaments and the jewellery left behind by the fleeing court, everything made of jade or gold, silver or silk, fell into the hands of the looters. When the summer houses, hunting lodges and sacred places in the extensive gardens and neighbouring palace precincts, more than 200 in number, were then burnt to the ground, it was on the orders of the commanding officers, ostensibly in reprisal for the mistreatment of the British emissaries Locke and Parkes, but in reality so that the devastation already wrought should no longer be apparent. Apart from a few stone bridges and marble pagodas, all was destroyed. For a long time, swathes of smoke drifted over the entire area, and a great cloud of ash that obscured the sun was borne to Peking by the west wind, where after a time it settled on the heads and homes of those who, it was surmised, had been visited by the power of divine retribution. At the end of the month, with the example of Juan before them, the Emperor's officers felt obliged to sign without further ado the oft-deferred Treaty of Tientsin. The principal clauses, apart from fresh reparation demands that could scarcely be met, related to the rights of free movement and unhindered missionary activity in the interior of China, and to negotiation of a customs tariff with a view to legalizing the opium trade. In return, the Western powers declared themselves willing to uphold the dynasty, which meant putting down the Taiping Rebellion and crushing the secessionary movements of the Muslim population of the Shenzai, Ainan and Kansu Valley regions, in the course of which between 6 and 10 million people were made homeless or killed. In August 1861, After months of irresolution, Emperor Xianfeng lay in his whole exile, approaching the end of his short and dissipated life. The waters had already risen from his abdomen to his heart, and the cells of his gradually dissolving flesh floated like fish in the sea in the salt fluid that leaked from his bloodstream into every available space in the body tissue. Through his flickering consciousness, Xianfeng followed the invasion by foreign powers of the provinces of his empire by perfect proxy, as his own limbs died off and his organs flooded with toxins. He himself was now the battlefield on which the downfall of China was being accomplished, till on the 22nd of the month the shades of night settled upon him and he sank away wholly into the delirium of death. Following the return to court in Peking, the struggle for the powers of regency during the interregnum which inevitably ensued, since the heir to the dragon throne was not yet of age, was soon resolved in favor of the widow Tzedashai, who had risen from the ranks of concubines and even now had assumed the illustrious title of Dowager Empress, whose craving for power was insatiable. The princes who had acted as Xianfeng's viceroys during his absence were accused of conspiracy against the legitimate ruler, a crime for which there was no defense, and they were condemned to be dismembered and cut into slices. When this sentence was commuted and the traitors were granted permission, offered to them in the form of a silken rope, to hang themselves, it was seen as a token of merciful clemency in the new regime. Once Princes Korn, Sushan and Yi had availed themselves of this prerogative, seemingly without any hesitation. The Dowager Empress was the uncontested locum of the Chinese Empire, at least until the time when her son became old enough to rule himself and began taking measures that ran counter to the plans she had nurtured to extend and perfect her power. Plans of which many had already been put into practice. Given this turn of events, it was tantamount to providential, from Tzedashai's point of view, that, a scant year after coming to the throne, Tian Chai was so weakened, by smallpox or by some other disease he had picked up, as rumor had it, from the dancers and transvestites of Peking's streets of sin, that when the planet Venus crossed before the sun in the autumn of 1874, a grim omen, there were fears for his life at the age of barely 19. And indeed Tian Chai did die, a few weeks later, on the 12th of January 1875. His face was turned to the south, and for the journey into the beyond he was enrobed in the vestments of eternal life. The funeral obsequies had scarcely been completed in the prescribed form when the wife of the departed emperor, 17 years old and several months pregnant according to various sources, poisoned herself with a massive dose of opium. The official version, that her mysterious death was due to the unassuageable grief that had overwhelmed her, could not entirely dispel the suspicion that the young empress had been got out of the way in order to prolong the regency of the Dowager Empress Tzedashai, who now consolidated her position by having her 2-year-old nephew Kung Hasu proclaimed heir to the throne. The way the Dowager Empress, in other respects extremely conservative in her views, contrived to flout the most venerable precepts when it became necessary, was one sign of her craving for absolute power, which grew more ruthless with every year that passed. And like all absolute rulers, she was concerned to display her exalted position to the world at large, and to herself by a lavishness beyond comparison. Her private household alone, managed by senior eunuch Li Lianing, standing to her right in this picture, went through a truly appalling annual sum of £6 million. The more ostentatious the demonstrations of her authority became, however, the more the fear of losing the infinite power she had so insidiously acquired grew within her. Unable to sleep, she roamed the bizarre shadow landscapes of the palace gardens, amidst the artificial crags, the groves of ferns, and the dark arboretum cypresses. In the early morning she swallowed a pearl ground to powder, as an elixir of invulnerability. She took the greatest of pleasure in lifeless things, and by day would sometimes stand for hours at the windows of her apartments, staring out upon the silent lake to the north, which resembled a painting. The tiny figures of the gardeners in their distant lily fields, or those of the courtiers who skated on the blue ice in winter, did not recall to her the natural occupations and feelings of humankind, but were rather like flies in a jam jar, already in the wanton power of death. Travelers who were in China between 1876 and 1879 report that, in the drought that had continued for years, whole provinces gave the impression of expiring under prisons of glass. Between 7 and 20 million people, no precise estimates have ever been calculated, are said to have died of starvation and exhaustion, principally in Shanxi, Shenzhen and Shantung. A Baptist preacher named Timothy Richard, for example, noted that one effect of the catastrophe, which grew more apparent week by week, was that all movement was slowing down. Singly, in groups and in straggling lines, people tottered across the country, and the merest breath of air might suffice to topple them and leave them lying by the wayside forever. Simply raising a hand, closing an eyelid, or exhaling one's last breath might take, it sometimes seemed, half a century, and as time dissolved, so too did all other relations. Parents exchanged children because they could not bear to watch the dying torment of their own. Towns and villages were surrounded by deserts of dust, over which trembling mirages of river valleys and forested lakes often appeared. Sometimes at first light, when the rustling of leaves dry on the branch penetrated their shallow sleep, people imagined, for a fraction of a second in which wishful thinking was stronger than what they knew to be the case, that it had started to rain. Though the capital and its environs were spared the worst consequences of the drought, when the ill tidings arrived from the south, the Dowager Empress had a daily blood sacrifice offered in her temple to the gods of silk, at the hour when the evening star rose, lest the silkworms want the fresh green leaves. Of all living creatures, these curious insects alone aroused a strong affection in her. The silk houses they were raised in were among the finest buildings of the summer palace. Every day that came, Tzai walked the airy halls with the ladies of her retinue, clad in white pinafores, to inspect the progress of the work, and when night fell she particularly liked to sit all alone amidst the frames, listening to the low, even, deeply soothing sound of the countless silkworms consuming the new mulberry foliage. These pale, almost transparent creatures, which would presently give their lives for the fine thread they were spinning, she saw as her true loyal followers. To her they seemed the ideal subjects, diligent in service, ready to die, capable of multiplying vastly within a short span of time, and fixed on their one so preordained aim. Holy and like human beings, on whom there was basically no relying, neither on the nameless masses in the empire nor on those who constituted the inmost circle about her and who, she suspected, might over at any time to the side of the second child emperor she had installed. Kung Hesu, who was fascinated by the mysteries of modern machines, spent most of his time taking apart the mechanical toys and clocks sold by a Danish tradesman in his Peking shop, and it was still possible to distract his awakening ambition by promising him a real railway train which he would be able to ride across his own country. But the day was not long remote when his would be the power which she, the Dowager Empress, was ever less able to relinquish the longer she possessed it. What we do have on authority is that Qing Husu's attempts to wrest power to himself ultimately led to his being imprisoned in one of the moated palaces in the Forbidden City, where he was forced to abdicate and make over the power of government, without reservation, to the Dowager Empress. For 10 years Qing Husu languished in exile on his paradisiacal island until in the late summer of 1908, the various ailments that increasingly troubled him since the day of his deposition, chronic headaches and backache, renal cramps, hypersensitivity to light and noise, weak lungs, and severe depression, finally overcame him. One Dr. Chu, who was familiar with Western medicine and was the last to be consulted, diagnosed Bright's disease, but also noted a number of inconsistent symptoms: palpitations of the heart, an empurpled complexion, a yellow tongue, that suggest, as has since been speculated, that Qing Husu was gradually poisoned. On the 14th of November 1908 at dusk, or, as they say, at the hour of the cockerel, Qing Husu, racked with pain, departed this life. At the time of his death he was 37 years old. Strangely enough, the 73-year-old Dowager Empress, who had destroyed his body and his spirit with such persistent intent, outlived him by less than a day. On the morning of the 15th of November, still in reasonably good health, she presided over the Grand Council's deliberations upon the new situation, but after her midday meal, which in defiance of her personal doctor's warnings she had concluded with a double helping of her favourite pudding, crab apples with clotted cream, she was stricken with an attack resembling dysentery, from which she did not recover. She died at about 3 o'clock. Already draped in her shroud, she dictated her farewell to the empire, which now after the near half-century of her regency was in the throes of dissolution. Looking back, she said, she realized that history consists of nothing but misfortune and the troubles that afflict us. So that in all our days on earth we never know one single moment that is genuinely free of fear.